mental health issues are associated with not eating enough food. There are studies that show if you restrict people of calories, there's an increase in depression and anxiety, and there's even an increase in disordered eating habits and behaviors.
Jessica is the director of Ellipse Health
and holds a PhD in nutrition awarded by the Faculty of Medicine.
She prides herself on helping individuals lose weight
and health at the University of Sydney
and regain control of their health by eating more food, not less.
Can you please just explain to us what do you mean by that?
Most times when people think about weight loss, they think about eating less and moving more. What I've learned through personal experience and looking at the research is that's not necessarily true. And even if it is true for the short term, it's not true for the long term. If that's actually not an effective way to lose weight, then what else can be done? One of the most effective ways.
Welcome to Chief Life, the podcast that cuts the crap with science-backed insights on health, nutrition, and performance. Get expert advice, actionable tips, and everything you need to take control of your health and live your best life. Let's get started.
Jessica Turton, welcome. I'm so excited to have you on today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here, and it's exciting that you guys have launched a podcast.
Thank you. We have been following your work for a very long time, and we love that you're so aligned with us in regards to eating, especially eating meat, eating natural foods. And I am so excited you picked this topic because this is a very controversial topic, and a lot of experts have lots of different discussions on this topic, especially on Instagram. So I'm very excited to set the record straight. So the topic is eat more to lose weight. Can you please just explain to us to start with what do you mean by that?
Yeah. Well, I guess that's a loaded question. I could probably just go on and on and on. But I'll try to give like a brief overview.
Yeah.
Most times when people think about weight loss and dieting for weight loss specifically, they think about eating less and moving more. You know, we've heard the kind of like calories in versus calories out. And like even when you speak to a lot of healthcare professionals, academics, professors, and then the everyday person, everybody is pretty much in agreement that if you eat less food, you lose weight. But what I've learned through personal experience and working with clients, looking at the research, is that's not necessarily true. And even if it is true for the short term, it's not true for the long term. And there are a lot of side effects of losing weight with that approach, even if it is successful. So then I started looking at, well, what else is possible? Because, you know, if that's actually not an effective way to lose weight, and that's like the standard that everybody thinks, you know, you should do and does work, then what else can be done? And I started looking into this idea of, you know, your metabolism and ways that you can actually get your body to burn more energy. And interestingly, one of the most effective ways to get your own body to expend more energy every single day is by eating more food. And so then we have to think about, you know, the right types of foods to eat more of so that we're supporting general health, we're increasing nutrient status, but actually improving the metabolic rate. And since applying this approach in my practice with my clients, what we have found is that individuals who have been dieting for years and decades on the standard eat less approach suddenly start eating more food. And not only do they actually start losing weight in a healthy way, but they also get better energy levels, improved mental clarity, increased strength and performance when they're at the gym and doing physical activity. So there is a huge amount of benefits, and I'm extremely passionate about spreading awareness that eating less and moving more is not the only way to lose weight.
That's great. So let's just unravel this. So by eating more, do you mean eating more volume or eating more calories? Because I can eat more greens, but it's less calories than if I had one chocolate bar. So what do you mean by eating more?
That's a
Just
good
to
question.
specify.
It's a great question actually, because so many people probably think that, and I really have never clarified that before. But in terms of eating more, we are talking about eating more calories. So more calories, and it's those calorie dense foods that are real whole foods and nutrient dense foods that we do want to increase. And, that takes us to kind of like another side of dieting where you have like this group of really health conscious people that eat a lot of vegetables and fruit, plant-based foods. And so they eat huge volumes of food. Like I have a lot of vegan clients who just, it's like a full-time job with how much they have to eat through the day. But unfortunately, those foods are really low in calories. Just by definition, those plant foods are very low in calories, also very low in nutrient value. And so that's not really what I'm talking about when I'm talking about eating more, because we know to increase the metabolic rate, we actually have to consume more digestible calories. So foods high in protein and fats specifically.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. So how does it technically work? If someone eats more energy than they require, wouldn't they physically put on weight?
That's the thing. We're not necessarily talking about eating more energy than what is required. We really need to kind of clear that up because with the eat less, move more messaging, most of the time, people who give out that advice are not asking how much you're eating currently. So, for example, someone who is overweight or struggling with their weight might be sitting down watching TV, and then like an ad comes on about how, I don't know, like Light and Easy or something is recommending these low calorie diets for weight loss. And so people get this idea that they're just eating too much and they need to cut back, but it's not taking into account what they're eating now. What I've noticed is that for most people who are struggling with their weight, and it's not all, but a lot of people who have good intentions and they're trying to manage their weight, we often observe that they're already restricting calories. So they're actually already following that advice to try and eat less, right? Because it's just kind of ingrained in us that if you're overweight, you should cut back on calories. And even if they're not eating less all of the time, it's still their intention for like their good days, like they're planning or trying to eat less food. And so when we talk about the eat more approach, we actually want to assess patients on an individual basis, or at least that's how I work, and find out not just how much they're eating currently, but do a pretty good estimation of what their energy requirements should be and what they actually should be burning and should be eating every single day. And we take into account like their body weight, their goal body weight, their stress levels, their physical activity levels, and muscle mass, and so on. And so when we talk about eating more, a lot of the times we're talking to those people who are already restricting and actually eating far less than what their body requires. So we're trying to teach them how much energy their body needs. And for most people, it's more than they think. Most people think, oh yeah, 1,200 calories a day is all I need, because they're just so used to all these weight loss diets that they've heard about or they followed before. And so it's about reframing. Well, actually, most women need 2,000 to 3,000 calories every single day, right? Not 1,200, not 1,500, not even 1,800. They need over 2,000. Men need significant amounts more. And then if you take into account someone who's physically active and has a lot of muscle mass, you're dialing that up more and more and more. So we're not necessarily trying to get patients to eat excessive amounts of calories. We're trying to get them to meet their energy demands. And it's usually a lot higher than what they're currently eating or what they think they should be eating.
Okay, interesting. So do you actually make people to count calories?
It depends. So most of the time, no. So I'm not a fan of counting calories, and I do feel that when I work with clients, that should be my job and not their job. I can do a really good assessment on someone's diet and figure out how many calories they're eating and whether or not they need more, and that can be a conversation that we have so that they're understanding of that. We can work out their energy requirements together and they can really see, oh, there's a shortfall. And then when we talk about eating more food, I'm not necessarily saying, okay, get out your diet tracking app and start counting more calories and you need to hit this calorie target. What I'm more so doing is giving them like a framework that they can follow. And so generally we give patients like a list of foods, like here are your recommended sources of proteins, your recommended sources of healthy fats, and, fruits and veggies and things that, are going to keep your blood sugars nice and stable. And then we give them like minimum portions. So for example, I might say, okay, well, at each meal, you want to aim for at least 150 grams of these protein-rich foods, and then at least 2 tablespoons of fat, for example, depending on how much they need to eat more, right? So you give them these minimum portions. But then another really important component of this is allowing these people or encouraging people to eat to satiety. Because if we eat to satiety, as long as we're in tune with satiety, and that can be really hard, but if we eat to satiety, we're actually listening to our body, and we're not listening to a calorie target. We're not even listening to me and my calculations. We're letting our body guide us in how much food we should be eating. And this is a really useful strategy when you're eating real whole foods. If we talk about eating to satiety for Doritos or like deep fried chicken or something like that, it's not going to work, right? But if we're talking about real whole foods and we're balancing proteins with fats and any carbohydrates that we're adding, it's a really good strategy to follow and to aim for. And so that's what we encourage. We help guide our patients in what eating more looks like without counting calories most of the time if we can avoid it. And then we also use that concept of eating to satiety.
Yeah, I love that. I just think that counting calories is such a waste of mental space. I always tell people, how much more time you would have to think about better things if you didn't count calories. And it's true. If you eat whole foods, you just feel full and you don't want to eat anymore. But yeah, if you have a block of chocolate, you can keep going, right? Or the Doritos. So yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah.
Those foods are designed to bypass your satiety signals, aren't they? So like we literally can't eat to satiety with Doritos and chocolates and lollies. I mean, look, there's probably like a small subset of people that can, they just eat a little bit and they're fine with that. But I would say for most people, it's difficult.
Yeah, difficult. Definitely difficult for most. But tell us, so what are the consequences of dieting when let's say you have nutritious diet, you don't eat processed foods or ultra processed foods, but you don't eat enough energy. You have your meat and veggies and stuff, but you're always in calorie deficit. What are the consequences?
Yeah. So the biggest issue is when people restrict their calories below their resting metabolic rate. And the resting metabolic rate is basically the amount of energy that your body needs to fuel its vital organ systems. So energy required for the brain, energy required for the lungs, for the liver, for the sex hormones, even for your skin and your digestion and all of that to function properly. Most people are so focused on weight loss and dieting and calories that they actually forget there is this fundamental reason we eat food, and that is to get energy so we can not only survive but thrive. And we rarely think, oh yeah, all those organ systems require energy. So when we talk about restricting below that metabolic rate, basically what we're saying is that a lot of people out there are not eating enough food to provide their vital organ systems with adequate energy. And so those organ systems start to function less effectively, essentially, because they don't have as much energy. So for example, if your brain isn't getting enough energy, you can experience brain fog and memory issues. Even poor focus and issues with eyesight can be a side effect. We know that mental health issues are associated with not eating enough food. So there are studies that show if you restrict people of calories, there's an increase in depression and anxiety. And there's even an increase in disordered eating habits and behaviors. We know that if you're not getting enough energy to your digestive tract, then your digestion is not going to function properly. So you may get bloating, you may get constipation, diarrhea, lots of gas, a lot of pain, discomfort. If energy is not going to your muscles, you're going to notice muscle wasting. And in severe cases, it is called sarcopenia, which is a major disease associated with an increased risk of metabolic disease and all these other issues like breaking bones and osteoporosis and all of that. We know that if the thyroid doesn't get enough energy, then that is something that's going to cause insulin resistance. It can also affect our body temperature, cause low body temperature. It's going to dramatically affect our energy levels and the way we function and show up each day. So everything in the body requires energy, but it's so interesting as we talk through those symptoms, so many people accept those things as just being like normal. Like, oh yeah, I have brain fog, I have low energy, I have gut issues. And these are things that are so common. And really what I find, like the more that I've looked into this and the more patients I've worked with, whether people are intentionally trying to lose weight or not, I do notice that most people really have no idea how much food they should be eating. And most people will underestimate their energy requirements. And I think people that like are most at risk of this are sometimes the healthiest people, in the sense that they have the healthiest intentions. As you said before, that they're eating all the right types of foods, but simply just not eating enough. And so whether their intention is to lose weight or not, or just experience better health, I think eating more of the right types of foods can be extremely beneficial for lots of people.
Okay, it's interesting. So I understand it, when you don't eat enough, obviously your organs don't work and stuff. But do you have a lot of people that you think they don't eat enough and they have issues with their weight? And when they come to you and you get them to eat more, what are the, like, I don't know how to express it, like what is the process? Like, do they initially gain some more weight and then they start losing weight, or do they start losing weight straight away? What do you get them to do? Like, I just want to paint a picture of like a little bit more specific example of someone like that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, so the way that it impacts your ability to lose weight is because when you are not eating enough calories and your metabolic rate becomes suppressed, now your body is simply burning less energy. So like a good example is the Biggest Loser contestants, or the Biggest Loser study that was done. We know that their resting metabolic rate was somewhere, I can't remember the numbers exactly, but it was over 2,000 calories. So they were burning 2,000 calories simply just by existing and living, nothing to do with their physical activity. And then when they followed the low-calorie diet that caused significant weight loss, their resting metabolic rate plummeted. And it plummeted by about 500 calories per day. So now it's far less than 2,000 calories every day. So now their body is just burning less energy. But what we notice is when these people stop the diet and they start eating more food, or they start eating normally, the metabolic rate doesn't always increase. It can stay suppressed, and it can stay suppressed for quite a long time. So when these people start eating more calories again, they actually notice a significant increase in weight, because now their body's burning less energy just to survive. They're eating more calories and they've got this huge calorie surplus because their metabolic rate has been suppressed. And most people think about it as like a slow metabolism. It's not really the right term, but like that's how people would usually describe it. Like, I have a slow metabolism. I just put on weight looking at a piece of cake, right? Like those kinds of people, they know exactly what I mean. And what's really interesting is that we found in research, if you just return someone's calories to their normal baseline calorie intake, it doesn't always increase their metabolic rate. You actually, a lot of the times, have to increase their calories even further than what they were doing before. But as you said, for a lot of people, that would just lead to an increase in weight before they saw a decrease. So most of the times they would start eating more food again, see an increase, get scared, and start cutting back on calories. So that's why with the eat more to lose weight approach, I really like to focus on like how to increase calories. It's, yes, about the types of foods, but it's also about the balance of different types of foods. It's also about how frequently you're eating across the day. And so there's a fair bit to it, but at the end of the day, it's a simple approach. It's something that we want people to be able to take with them for the rest of their lives and follow a lifestyle. It's not a diet that you would just go on and off, go on and off. But in terms of like the results, the initial goal is to increase the metabolic rate. And so the initial goal isn't necessarily weight loss, because we're talking about people who have already got suppressed, impaired metabolisms. It's hard to lose weight when you have an impaired metabolism. It's hard on any approach. So we've got to get that metabolism up. So we've got to get them burning more energy again. So I usually say to people in the first 3 months, don't expect weight loss. If it comes, beautiful, that's great. But if it doesn't, that's also fine. What you should expect in the first 3 months is an increase in energy, improved mental clarity, improved cognition, improved focus, potentially improved mental health as well, more strength, more stamina, and maybe improved digestion if they got digestive issues. So it's more so the symptoms that we start to notice improve, and that tells us that those organ systems are getting more energy, right? And it tells us the metabolic rate is going up. And then once their body is burning more energy, hopefully by their sort of 3-month mark, then from there, we can actually either just wait and see if their body starts losing weight just on that increase in energy, or we can implement specific strategies to help their body now start losing weight. And I must say, most of the time, it just happens on its own, right? Like their body repairs their metabolic rate, and then they start tuning into satiety, like hunger and satiety a little bit more. And because they feel so much better and they've got more energy, they may not need to eat as much food at this point because their body can now start to run on stored body fat.
Yeah. That's great. Do you think it's good something to do also with reduced inflammation and improved insulin control because they switched from not so nutritious foods to real foods that have more nutrients and maybe less sugar and crap in it?
Yeah, 100%. I think, calories is one part of this, and it's, an important part to talk about and for people to get their head around. But the increase in nutrient density makes a huge difference. We know that if someone is not eating enough iron, for example, then they don't have as good ability to carry oxygen around their blood. Your body needs oxygen to burn fat, and it certainly needs more oxygen to burn fat than it does glucose. And so simply being iron deficient can be a barrier to people losing weight. And so with this eat more approach, we're looking at ways to get more nutrients in that facilitate burning fat. Absolutely. And then you're right, with the eat more to lose weight approach that we use, at least, it is a low carb diet because the literature tells us that if you replace energy from carbs with energy from fats, you can increase metabolic rate. And so low carb diets actually help to increase that metabolic rate and help us to burn more energy. I would say for some people it's not 100% essential, but particularly those people who have insulin resistance, who might have had type 2 diabetes or are dealing with blood sugar issues, going for a lower carb approach is definitely beneficial because you've got to bring that insulin down. As you're alluding to, no matter how many calories you eat, if your insulin levels are high, you will be in that sort of fat storage state. So that's why we like to work with individuals one-on-one, because everybody has different barriers to weight loss. And so this is certainly not a one-size-fits-all.
Yeah, 100%. But generally spoken, the low-carb diet made from real foods should also be beneficial for women in menopause and perimenopause because of the insulin resistance and inflammation. Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think those women find it the most difficult to lose weight. And oftentimes going through that stage of your life, you might not have even had weight issues in the past. Like you may have never had to go on a diet before. And suddenly you're like, whoa, I'm gaining weight and I don't know what to do about it. And it's because those hormonal changes are so significant. But yeah, a lower carb approach, eating more healthy fats, eating more protein, eating more food of the right types of foods can be really beneficial.
Yeah. So that completely makes sense, and I agree with you. But then I'm also like torn with other part of this whole equation, which is longevity. Because there is a lot of research in longevity that says that 10 to 20% reduction in calories or 10 to 20% calorie restriction without malnutrition extends our health span and lifespan and prevents age-related diseases and things like that. How do you combine these two thoughts of school of thoughts?
Well, I think if someone has a healthy metabolism and they're not dealing with issues like type 2 diabetes, some calorie restriction used intermittently can certainly be helpful. And, that's why I think you need to look at this in stages, right? Like that initial stage needs to be addressing any therapeutic issues. Like if there's insulin resistance or nutrient deficiencies, like you have to follow a specific dietary plan to really address those. And they are far more important than any longevity research piece, because if you've got type 2 diabetes, there's an early death right there, right?
Yeah, 100%.
And if you have nutrient deficiencies, another early death, right? Like these things are essential for life. So irrespective of what that research says, we know that we need to address those fundamental issues first. And then once you are in this healthy place where, your metabolism has come back up to where it needs to be, it's being repaired, so to speak, you don't have nutrient deficiencies, you don't have insulin resistance or whatever it may be, I do feel like the body can withstand some calorie restriction, but I think that calorie restriction has to be intermittent. And I also feel that people need to understand what their energy requirements are before they restrict, because otherwise we end up in that same issue that we spoke about at the beginning, where people just keep eating less, they keep doing more and more fasting or whatever it may be, but they're never actually fueling and they're not getting that part right as well. So I think they can definitely come hand in hand, and maybe that would promote better longevity, perhaps, for sure. But I think it's not going to suit everyone, because getting to that place where you have no health issues and you don't have nutrient deficiencies, for a lot of people, that's hard. And that's what they need to focus on before they start thinking about layering all these other things on top.
Yeah. I think a lot of the times this information is, and all the research is also taken out of the context. Don't you think that it would be probably different for a woman in reproductive age and someone who is 80 years old? Probably the person who is 80 years old would maybe benefit from the calorie restriction and focusing mainly on protein. But if someone is 30 and they're trying to conceive a child, that's probably not the best idea. I think there's a lot of good information out there, but it's not presented well and it's taken out of the context. And that's why I just want to ask you, like, what do you think about this? Like, is the diet also very different in the different stages of life, like whether you are growing up, trying to conceive, or you're elderly? What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, that's why I think it's important to always come back to that question is, what are my energy requirements now? And am I actually meeting those? Because that question in itself is a relatively difficult question to answer. You may need support to help answer that question, because there's not a lot of information out there about how you can kind of figure out how much energy you need. And what you do find out is that most of those like equations to help you estimate your energy requirements are certainly based on age, and they're certainly based on the stage of life you are in. So you are right. If you are pregnant or breastfeeding, or you've recently had a baby like me, your energy requirements are significantly higher. And you'll very rarely get that information, when you go to your doctor's appointments, or even if you see like dietitians that work in this space, you very rarely get that information about actually needing more energy for those stages. We also know that growing children obviously need more energy relative to kilogram of body weight, because they are physically growing. But the same is true for people who are under a lot of mental load. So I think one thing that adults often find themselves in the trap of is they say, well, I'm not growing anymore, so I don't need all this protein. I don't need all this energy, right? Like I've got all this fat, I can just use that. But that's not really true, because, if you have a mentally demanding workload, even if you're not that physically active, your brain uses a huge amount of energy. So that's something we need to take into account when we're estimating energy requirements. And that can really be any stage of your adult life. a lot of people around their 40s or 50s have like very highly demanding jobs, but even people in their 70s and 80s can be doing a lot. Like I have a lot of patients, elderly patients, who are literally working more than like a full-time work person. They're like looking after grandkids. They're also running this business on the side. They're socializing, and like it adds up to quite a lot. So the different stage of life comes into play, but someone's physical and mental workload, and then also, what might be going on for them in the sense if they've had a surgery recently, or, as we just said, they just had a baby or something like that. All of these things must be taken into account when it comes to energy requirements.
Yeah. So how do you actually estimate your clients' energy requirements? Do you use those traditional equations, or do you have any other methods? Or are they secret?
They're not secrets.
Maybe you have like a trade secret that you can't tell us. I'm curious.
The more people learn about how to understand the energy requirements, the better, right? Like, we
Yeah.
always want to teach people. But look, it depends. It depends on what information we have. So usually what will happen is when we see a patient, we ask a lot of questions to kind of not just figure out their energy requirements, but also figure out their nutrient requirements and other things like that. But in terms of the energy requirements specifically, we do use the standard equations like the Schofield equations, but we try to make it as specific as possible, because you can basically just use those equations and plug in your weight and it will spit out some kind of energy requirement. So there's a lot of other things that need to be considered. So like we just said, age and stage of life, whether someone's breastfeeding, pregnant, postpartum, whether they've just had a surgery, or if someone has an inflammatory condition. So if someone has like an autoimmune disease, especially one that isn't well managed, or if someone has like they've just had an injury, for example, and it might be a chronic injury. These are things that actually add to the inflammatory load in the body. And so you have to apply what is known as a stress factor to these equations, essentially. And that can be quite difficult to do, right? Because like trying to figure out what someone's stress factor is, that's a job in itself. But this is why you need to collect as much information as you can about a person. And if someone's just thinking about their own energy requirements, it's worth thinking about, what's my physical activity? What are all like the stresses, whether it's positive or negative stress that I have to deal with on a daily basis, but also what are those internal stresses that my body has to deal with? Like, do I have thyroid issues? Like, do I have autoimmune disease? Do I have arthritis? Do I have an injury that my body needs to recover from? And basically all of those things will increase the amount of energy that you require in a day. And so it is a tricky thing, but mainly we use the equations and we will apply a physical activity factor and a stress factor. We will also take into account what someone's weight is currently and their healthy or ideal body weight. We take those things into account. We also take into account what would be like a healthy rate of weight loss, because I don't know if you've done this, but when you download like a diet tracking app and you're like, I want to be 50 kilos in 2 weeks, like I want to lose all this weight in 2 weeks. Like you give them this crazy goal that you're trying to achieve. And they're like, sure, no worries. Here's your calorie target. And it's like 800 calories a day. You don't want to do that. You don't want to achieve rapid weight loss. That really damages your metabolism no matter how you do it, right? So people who significantly cut back on calories to achieve these huge weight loss targets every single week are only just putting their metabolism through the floor. And so we find the rate of weight loss really helpful, because when you use these energy equations and sometimes when you plug in someone's goal weight, if they're really far away from that goal weight, that's too much of a calorie restriction for them. So sometimes we break it down. Like if someone has, say, 40 kilograms of weight to lose, we might just make their initial goal weight 5 kilograms less than their current weight, because it does bring down their energy requirements, the lower you go. And then add in the stress factors or whatever, because as you can kind of guess from what I'm saying and our approach, we really don't want patients over restricting calories. We're trying to get them to eat more than they're eating currently, but then also estimating their energy requirements as accurately as possible without restricting too much if they want to lose weight.
Yeah, great. And do you use intermittent fasting as a tool in your practices, or are you not a proponent of it?
Well, again, it's about like where people are in their like stage
Yeah.
and their health status. I think it's a really good tool that should come naturally. So I think, again, once you've done the work to repair your metabolic rate, and usually during that stage, I would recommend 3 meals a day because it's extremely hard to eat enough energy and get in enough nutrients to increase your metabolic rate if you're only eating 1 or 2 meals a day.
Yeah.
I don't recommend lots of snacks. In fact, I would actually discourage snacks because I feel that it doesn't send a clear message to your body that you want to increase your metabolic rate. Sometimes if people are just kind of snacking or grazing, it actually sends the message that you're in a stressful environment. There's a food shortage, even if you're eating a lot of food over the course of the day. And so your body can actually keep that metabolic rate low as like a survival mechanism. But if people are eating 3 square meals and they're eating like the same amount of calories, but 3 square meals, the body is getting that sense of safety, like, there's energy, there's nutrients, and there's plenty of it, right? And it doesn't have to wait too long before that next hit of energy, but it's also not coming so frequently that the body thinks, oh, what's going on, right? So I think 3 meals a day is really nice to boost that metabolic rate up. But then once we've repaired the metabolic rate, energy levels are really good, and people are in tune with hunger and satiety, at that point, we can basically use the hunger and satiety as more of a gauge. So rather than being so prescriptive, people might actually say, well, I just don't need lunch today, right? Like I feel so good. My energy levels are fantastic. I'm really satiated from breakfast. And so I will just skip lunch naturally because their body's telling them they can do that. And for other people, it might be dinner. For other people, it might be breakfast. Or they might just compress all their 3 meals into a shorter eating window because that's what their body tells them is right. And that's totally fine. I would say that, if you're listening to your body, and as long as your body is sending you those signals like energy is good, mental clarity is good, you're not, getting infections every 2 days and all of that sort of stuff, like you're getting those signals that you're well, you've got plenty of energy, and you're supporting your metabolic rate, then I think those tools, layering them on top, is totally fine. And for a lot of people, even more beneficial for their goal of weight management, for example.
That's super interesting with the snacking. So when you say 3 meals a day, how many hours would you space them apart for it to not slow down the metabolism again? What would be optimal?
I mean, I probably wouldn't stress too much about that because the way that I would think about it is so you've kind of got 2 groups of people here. You've got a group of people where they've been dieting for so long and under-eating for so long that they just cannot trust their hunger and satiety, because when your metabolic rate is so suppressed, you don't get hungry, right? Because your body has learned to like function on like no energy. So it just doesn't send you that signal anymore that it needs more energy. So with those sorts of people, it's really tricky. And sometimes I do need to be really specific, and I need to say, okay, at 9 a.m., this is what you will eat and how much.
Yeah.
At 1 p.m., this is what you will eat and how much. At 6 p.m., this is what you'll eat and how much, because they're really out of touch with their body's signals. Yeah. But for most people who can tune into hunger and satiety, we don't necessarily need to get too bogged down by when these 3 meals are. The strategy that I usually give is that you want to make that meal, each meal, satiating enough so that you can go at least 4 hours before you feel hungry or start thinking about food or your energy drops. So like, for example, some people might make themselves like yogurt and berries for breakfast, right? Like they're like, oh, yum, that's good, healthy food, yogurt and berries. But yoga and berries, there's not a lot of energy in there. There's certainly not a lot of protein. And they're going to find themselves hungry like an hour later or, 2 hours later. And they're going to start thinking about food, craving food. And they're going to be like, this sucks. I can't wait till lunch. And so that is an indicator that you need to eat more at that meal, add more protein, add more healthy fat, because you really want it to take about 4 hours before you start getting those signals to eat again. So yeah, and maybe I don't tell people the time specifically, but yes, spacing them out over the day is definitely handy.
Yeah, I'm just asking because some people get only hungry once a day, and some people eat too frequently. So I was just asking, what would you think would be the ideal window between the meals? So about 4 hours at least.
Yeah, at least. So like some people find that like their first meal is at 8 a.m. and their second meal is at 12, but then they can go 6 or 7 hours before dinner. And so if it's a little bit longer, that's totally fine, but probably no shorter than 4 hours because it would just mean you're not eating enough.
Yeah, that is true. And what do you think about circadian eating and late night dinners and things like that? Do you believe that people should eat a little bit less in the evening, or is it a myth?
I don't think it's a myth. I do think it's definitely an important thing. I mean, it makes so much sense biologically that, before we had all this technology and artificial light, we would be asleep when it was dark, like we wouldn't be having a meal necessarily. So I don't think it's a myth at all. I think there's a lot of merit to it for sure. But at least with the clients I see, that is kind of like a level of, it's like that next level of strategies that often people don't get to. And usually it's because people do have these demands and commitments in their lives that really prevent that from being a possibility. So for example, a lot of people working night shift or people running their own businesses and not getting home till 11 p.m. And that's the only opportunity they have to eat. And if we start telling these people, oh, you can only eat when the sun is up or something like that, then you're putting more restrictions and rules on them and you're actually causing them to eat even less than they were before because eating when the sun's up isn't a possibility. So we do have to take that into account. I would much rather people eat enough of the right food and the right types of foods than worry about when they're actually eating those foods. But if people have the capacity to, eat according to their circadian rhythm and, have a nice early breakfast and an earlier dinner, that would be lovely. But I just don't think it's possible for everyone.
Yeah. So it's kind of like a hierarchy of strategy. You first fix the most important things, nutrients, eating enough. And then if you cover that, then you can roll on more of those strategies like intermittent fasting, circadian eating. Get it?
Exactly. 100%.
Yeah, that's great. Well, that's very helpful because I think there are a lot of people out there, from what I can see, that really starve themselves and struggle to lose weight. And there are a lot of people that, as you said, eat a lot of veggies and also have issues with health. So that's my next question is, what do you think about the carnivore diet that everyone is on recently? I have a lot of clients coming to me asking me about the carnivore diet, if there is a good idea. What do you think about it?
We definitely use it in practice as an elimination diet. There are certainly lots of people that benefit from eliminating fibrous foods from their diet. So whether you call it the carnivore diet or not, we definitely don't call it the carnivore diet, that's for sure. It's a fantastic elimination diet. Not only does it like eliminate plant foods, but it eliminates processed foods and all that junk as well that we know increases inflammation. Most people wouldn't argue about that. So it's a fantastic tool, as we were speaking about before when we're talking about our strategies. The way we would use it, I mean, certainly for people who have like autoimmune diseases, particularly gut conditions, chronic gut conditions like inflammatory bowel disease, or really uncontrolled autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, for example, it can be really beneficial. And, there's emerging research to show that, hey, this is actually potentially an evidence-based approach. The thing about the carnivore diet is I do find when people have been following it for a long time, they sometimes fall into that trap of not eating enough and potentially getting nutrient deficiencies as a result. Maybe because they're not eating enough, but also maybe because they're actually not aware of how to get their different nutrients on a carnivore diet. And it is 100% possible to follow a carnivore diet and get all your nutrients. But it requires planning, and it requires planning for every diet, to be honest. But I just think because the carnivore diet involves a lot of meat, people are often extremely satiated, and then they just end up not eating as much as a result, which again, in the short term can be really beneficial. But then following that particular diet for years and years and years, and these nutrient deficiencies getting worse, energy's plummeting, people kind of start saying, oh, well, what's wrong? Because I'm following this carnivore diet, so why isn't it working for me? So I absolutely think that it has a place, and I'm a huge proponent of like an animal-based diet, eating lots of those animal foods because they are some of the most nutrient-dense foods. So I definitely think increasing animal products is beneficial. Whether or not like you have to restrict all of plant foods, I think is definitely an individual thing, and people need to constantly assess how they feel. You know, if you feel good, amazing. But if you start noticing that you're not feeling good anymore, maybe it's time to change your approach.
Yeah, that's great. I totally agree. And I speak to a lot of people that are on carnivore diets, but I actually struggle to find someone who just eats meat. People
Mm.
usually say they're carnivore, but it's a meat-based diet, and I think it's a great way to be. Based on the science that you've read and on the years in practice and all your studies, generally for someone who doesn't have any autoimmune disease, any issues, is just like an adult, healthy person, what do you think would be the healthiest diet?
Well, I like to actually, step away from the diet labels. Like,
Or nutrition, let's say, way of eating.
yeah, exactly. I think that's nice because even though, I mean, I did my PhD in low carbohydrate diets, and I like totally get we use these labels to categorize diets. But I think it's nice if you can, especially if you're talking about like the healthiest diet or the best approach for people. Stepping away from the labels is super handy, and actually just thinking about the strategies that kind of underpin that diet or the framework that underpins, because I think what most people find is like they take different strategies from different diets and they kind of like build their own diet, and that's what works best for them. In terms of like what's the healthiest diet for like the general population, we know that a healthy diet requires certain things. So in order for a diet to not just be like healthy, but to keep people alive, it needs to have a certain amount of protein. And what we see in the literature is that like that's a significant amount of protein. So our meals really should be based around protein foods. And that's things like meat, fish, eggs. If we're thinking about plant protein, it could be like nuts and seeds. It could be tofu. It could be legumes. But we know that protein provides us with the building blocks for what we are as humans. It is required for all of our enzymes, our hormones, our muscles, our skin. We cannot have a diet that doesn't have enough protein. We will get very sick and eventually die. So protein is like the core. And then the second most important thing for a generally healthy diet is energy. We have to make sure we've got enough energy to not only just like keep our organs functioning, but to be able to live and do the things we want to do, right? Like if you want to be going to the gym, if you want to be socializing, if you want to have a job, if you want to work, if you want to study, you have to have enough energy for that. And we know that we get our energy from fats or carbohydrates. And, it's completely up to people, if they get a mix of those things, or they just choose to get the energy from fats, or they just choose to get the energy from carbohydrates, that we do need a source of energy. Going for foods that are less processed tend to be like the best for most people from what we can see in the literature. I don't think there's a study that actually shows processed food is more advantageous than real food. And I think most people see that as like a really obvious point. Not everyone, but
Well, can I tell you something? I was at a sports nutrition conference last year, and one of the presenters, who is nutritionist, literally said that athletes need to eat ultra-processed foods because they can't cover their nutrient and calorie requirement from real foods because real foods have too much fiber and they would not be able to perform. So they need to eat ultra-processed foods. That was the presentation.
yeah, no, I think the sports nutrition world is extremely confusing, but it's extremely narrow-minded because that would be true if you were following a high carbohydrate diet and getting all of your energy from carbohydrate. But what we know is that athletes and the everyday person can use fat as an energy source too. Carbohydrates are not the only energy source. And if your body is using fat for energy, you don't necessarily need all these processed carbohydrates every 2-3 hours. And it's actually sad, really, because a lot of athletes end up with a lot of health issues because they are told exactly what you just said, where they are told to be eating lollies and chocolate and juices like almost constantly, right? Because all that matters when you're an athlete is fuel and getting energy into you. But that's so not true, right? Like these athletes care about their health. They care about how they feel. You know, sure, performance is important to them and it's more important to them than most people, particularly if we're talking about professional athletes. But, you know, to just like focus on processed foods and say, oh, well, their health doesn't matter as long as they perform well, I just think is unfair to athletes, because there are other ways of doing it. So that's interesting that you bring that up, because I totally know where you're coming from. And I get where they're coming from too, but I think it's narrow-minded in the sense that, sure, that's an option. And I'm not saying athletes shouldn't do that if that works for them, but I think they also need to understand there's other options. They don't have to eat processed food to fuel their fuel their performance and feel their best and all of that.
Yeah, 100%. Like what I think is like, okay, when they're 25, they can perform really well on ultra processed foods, but how they gonna feel when they're 35 or 45? Like life doesn't end with the athletic career. And I think so many of them actually have lots of damage to their health from being on such a diet. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, look, we work with a lot of athletes. We work with a lot of professional athletes, and that is their career, you know, to perform. And the reason they come to see us is not because they want to improve their performance. We're not sports dietitians. It's because they have all these health issues. They've got gut issues. They've got brain fog. They are sluggish. And, you know, they can do what they need to do to perform because they're fueling on all these like refined carbohydrates and sugars. And because most of them are running on stress hormones because, you know, like what they're doing is so demanding and they're usually not eating enough in general. They've got nutrient deficiencies and so on. But you're right. Like these athletes there's so much stress that they experience and they have such high energy demands. It requires work to make sure they're fueling those demands. But I think it is possible to fuel those demands and support their health. I don't think it's just one or the other. And unfortunately, a lot of athletes are kind of made to believe their health doesn't matter. And a lot of the nutrition advice, like the actual sports dietitians that might work for particular, you know, professional athletic teams or individuals, they're never talking about health. It's always about performance. And I think that most people, if you really ask them, they want to improve both. They don't want to be retired and then be dealing with all these health issues, you know. We want to protect these athletes, and I think it is possible for sure.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for saying that. It really makes me happy. So back to the eat more to lose weight. If someone wants to explore this method, they can either book an appointment with you at Ellipse Health, and I will put the links to the show notes. But is there anything else they can do? Like, do you have any course or any type of education people can access to learn more about this?
Yeah, so I I have done a presentation on this, which kind of talks about what we have talked about today, but it references the specific science, and there's like diagrams and other things like that, and it kind of flows in a nice way. And that is free. That's available on YouTube. So I'll definitely give you the link and people can go and watch that.
Amazing.
And I talk about this a lot on my Instagram, so I can send you the link to my Instagram. I'm constantly posting information about this approach and just nutrition and health in general. And I have developed a course. So I realized that, for some people, there is quite a lot to think about for this approach. And as much as I like to describe it as like an easy or a simple approach, there's a fair bit to it. And I think it's nice to kind of like break it down into sections and for people to not just know what to eat, but to know why. And so this particular course has a lot of education in it as to like why these recommendations can be helpful, because I think that really empowers people to make sustainable behavior change. Like you can just give someone a meal plan, but that's not necessarily going to translate to long-term health improvements. If we teach people like the why behind things, I think they're much more likely to change their behaviors long term. So I'm hoping that, for the people who have already done this course, I know that they've seen a lot of positive benefit already. I just had a patient who did the course and 6 months later they had dropped 12 kilograms and they said it was super easy and effortless, which was amazing.
That's amazing.
So I'll link that course for people because it's something that they can complete at their own pace. It's just online. A lot of patients are like listening to the modules of the course while they're going for a walk or something like that. So you don't necessarily have to like commit an hour a day to doing it, because I know for a lot of people that's just not possible. You can just take it at your own pace, and it's a very practical course. So it tells you exactly what to do and why.
That's amazing. Thank you. So I'm going to ask 2 questions that I ask everyone. If you could give only one health or fitness or wellness advice to all our listeners, what would the advice be? And the second question, what is your favorite book and why?
Wow. Okay, one piece of health advice. Eat more animal-based foods.
Love it.
And then a book. Oh my gosh.
It doesn't have to be health book, any book.
I have all these books that I'm looking at and I'm just like, I literally do not have time to read these. Look, actually this may not be my favorite book. It's just the book I most recently listened to on audiobooks, and it was so interesting. It's called Atlas of the Heart. And it's all about like different emotions and experiences and like connecting with others. And I've started reading it because I've just had a baby and, I want to learn about all of these emotions and experiences, and I want to learn more about human connection. And I felt that it was a really interesting book. I learned so much, and just the way that it's kind of laid out is fantastic. So I recommend that for sure.
Amazing. Thank you. I mainly asked this question because I love reading books. So I'm just getting tips here for myself.
Have you
But
read
thank you
that
so-
one? You read Atlas of the
No, I haven't read that one. I'm at the moment reading the book called Good Energy by Callie Means, and that's really good. It explains like in very simplified form about mitochondrial health and energy and things like that. It's very aligned with what you're saying as well. So it's great.
Well, I'll have to read that one. So you've given me a recommendation too.
Yeah. Recommend. Thank you so much for your time. That was amazing. I think our listeners got a lot of practical tips from there, and I hope everyone will start eating more meat after this.
I hope so too.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you, Veronica. Great to
Bye.
Thank you for listening. Let us know in the comments below what topics interest you, and don't forget to follow us.